apologize first for the quality of my voice. I have a cold. I hope that nothing will happen to you. But I'll try to sip some, some tea from time to time. That's why I'm apologizing.
His voice will carry, don't worry.
Now when Hannah Sanyura talked to me about this topic, he wanted also a little bit of theology. He did not want, directly, he did not want me to address really realpolitik immediately or the Islamic movements. He wanted basically he wanted me to talk about what Islam says about democracy. And practically, when we talk about democracy, going back to our own sources, definitely we'll be talking about shura if you follow these these topics. Now, shura, to start with, there are 3 verses in the Quran that directly use the word shura in one form or the other. One verse which is not usually cited, but is still important. It's about couples who might come to the decision of divorce, but the Quran says that if this decision comes through consultation, meaning that women are also part of this. And it's a very important verse, but that's not the typical verse that is used when we talk about shura as basically as a system that runs a state. The other 2 verses, one of them is in a chapter called the chapter of shura, and it's verse 38 if you need a reference, and it says, وَالَّذِينَ اسْتَجَابُوا لِرَبِّهِمْ وَأَقَامُوا الصَّلَاةَ وَأَمْرُهُمْ شُورَى بَيْنَهُمْ وَمِمَّا رَزَقْنَاهُمْ يُنْفِقُونَ. I will translate. And those, the description, the attributes of the believers are those who respond positively to revelation. They establish prayer. Shura is their way of conducting affairs amongst them, and they do spend from that which God has given them. Meaning that shura here is sandwiched between prayer and almsgiving. Now, prayer is an obligation, is a religious obligation, and almsgiving is another religious obligation, and hence scholars would say shura in itself is also an obligation. So it's we don't talk about now we don't talk about a right. We talk about a religious obligation to apply shura in politics. Now, why do I say politics and not something else? Because that which has been already given is not a matter of shura. For example, you don't change the month of Ramadan to another month simply because Ramadan falls during the summer. You don't change the time of the pilgrimage. You don't change the amount of almsgiving. It ranges between 2.5% on cash money, but that's not the time to talk about these things in details, to some 10% on some produce if they are irrigated with, rainwater. But the idea is that that which is given, that's not where the shura is applicable. What remains basically is politics. So the domain of shura is politics, and it's the category of shura as a religious obligation is very, very important. It means, by definition, it's against despotism, it's against autocracy, it's against, and in the history of in these 1400 years. For the most part, for the Sunnites, it has never been a theocracy. And this is not polemical. When we say it's not a theocracy, no one basically governed stating that it's that he has been chosen by God, or there's a divine, there's a right there. to be in that particular position. So, despite some of the claims, it has never been a theocracy. It's a down-to-earth business, where basically the head of state, who happened to be named Khalifa, Caliph, did not govern in the name of God when he issued something. It was based on consultation, and it's very famous. Ashiru alay ayyuhan nas. The caliphs asking people to present them with advice, and they will, of course, they will take decision based on the advice that they receive. The other verse in the Quran is from a chapter called Al-Imran. It's the third chapter of the Quran, and it's verse 159. And here, in this particular chapter, it does address the Prophet himself. وَشَاوِرْهُمْ فِي الْأَمْرِ فَإِذَا عَزَمْتَ فَتَوَكَّلْ عَلَى اللَّهِ. God basically addresses the Prophet himself, asking him to consult the community. And again, consulting the community is about business. It's basically about politics. It's not about, it's not about specific issues in Islamic law. And by the way, Sharia and halakha in Hebrew etymologically are the same. It's the path one way or the other. So here we have two verses. One of them stating that it's an obligation for the community to conduct their affairs, political affairs, using a system of shura. And the second one is asking the Prophet himself, who does receive revelation, which basically is understood as establishing the foundation for a political system that is based on consultation. And he himself, the Prophet, consulted with the community in important decisions. Now, if we look at the historical instances, the best probably instance that talks about the political affairs of Medina is what is described usually as the Constitution of Medina. The Constitution of Medina, or the Covenant of Medina, it was conducted originally between the Prophet and the Jewish tribes that lived in Medina and in the surrounding areas. And it's more than once I give the first page of that covenant as a gift to my friends, specifically where it starts with, and the Jews وَيَهُودْ بَنِي عَوْفْ أُمَّةٌ مَعَ الْمُسْلِمِينَ. And the Jews, the Jewish tribe of Bani Auf, form one ummah. And this is where basically the English translation will fail, because you cannot translate ummah. Because if you see nation, the modern notion of the nation state might come to the foreground. But the Prophet believed that he was basically doing something for the community at large, taking into consideration the different religions that existed there, and I would not use the word people. That's a different story. It does have different implications. But here we talk about multi-faith society. It is entrenched in that covenant, and it was not a religious covenant. It was a political document that does have the backing. And here we talk about the Prophet himself having that particular, what we call the Constitution of Medina, and it does specify the rights and the obligations of every side. And each side religiously is autonomous, but once it comes to the public order, to that which is of common interest, they will be on equal ground. And the basic line in the Quran is that there is no compulsion in religion. This is from chapter 2 of the Quran. So this is laying the foundation for a society where not only Muslims are part of the public order, but others too. In fact, some scholars, though they have, when I present something, does not necessarily that I basically subscribe to everything that I say here, because I might say things that are pro or against the argument. Dr. Ahmed Musalli, in a book called Jadaliyat al-Shura wal-Demokratiya, he basically, based on this covenant, the Constitution of Medina, he would say that this is good enough to establish a liberal democratic society. I might have reservation about the liberal, but if you read very well, the details of this, of his arguments, he does not talk about, liberalism as a social order, but really he talks about a liberal democracy in terms of the presence of, many voices, many parties, political parties. But it's a different reading altogether. The implementation of the notion of shura, we can see it in the life of the heads of state after the death of the Prophet. For example, choosing Abu Bakr as a head of state, it was a matter of consultation, not a democracy the way we know it today, and definitely not sophisticated elections. But there was one nominee from the indigenous people of Medina, and there was one nominee from the immigrants from Mecca, the Muhajirin, and Abu Bakr ultimately was chosen. A major personality who was not present in the shed Saqif al-Bani Sa'ida, a major personality that was not present there was Ali ibn Abi Talib, who was preparing the Prophet himself for burial, and hence the development of the Shiite position. Originally, simply, it started with one simple notion that Ali was more entitled to be head of state, and they believed that the Prophet appointed him as such. But that's where it started. No differences in the law, no different theological differences, nothing major except that particular position, and from that moment, different or various forms of development took place. If you are interested later on, we might say something about difference, for example, between the 12th Imamites and the Zaydis of Yemen regarding someone not from the family or the offspring of Ali bin Abi Talib coming to power. So the system of consultation continued, meaning that the Ummah at large had the right to appoint the head of state either directly or through some kind of, not representation the way we know it today, but there was some kind of representation in the sense of recognizing those who were representing the community at large in a liberal way. This continued until the time of Muawiyah, when a dynasty was established. So, in a sense, the dynasty, one might say it's going back to some tribal system, but it's establishing a dynasty, which is important. Now, when we talk about the shura, some of the issues that are raised, whether the shura itself, when it does take place, is it imperative for the head of state to accept the decision of the shura council in the language of today, or Ahl al-Hal wal-Aqd in the traditional language? Some would say that it is imperative for the head of state to accept. Some would say no, it is informative, so that when he makes a decision, it will be an informed decision. And this would be some of the difference between the Islamic Liberation Party and the Muslim Brotherhood, for example. The Islamic Liberation Party would say that it is not imperative. The Muslim Brotherhood would say it is imperative for the head of state to accept the decision. Now, in terms of the political form of the state, I would choose basically a couple of quotations. For the form of the state, Imam Haramain al-Juwayni, we talk about even the concept of medieval, it's a borrowed really concept, but he was the scholar that Al-Ghazali studied. We talk about the 5th century. He said about the political form, he said, لَيْسَ فِي الْأَمْرِ قَطْعًا. There is no absolute form for the state. And this is why Muslim scholars over the years, Muslim jurists, tolerated dynasties, they have tolerated kingdoms, they have tolerated principalities. There is something rooted in that kind of theology, that there is no absolute political form that one should subscribe to. The most important thing would be, as long as the leaders do implement the Sharia one way or the other in the life of the community, it becomes imperative for the community to obey those in office. And maybe I'll bring right now to the picture the position of the Salafi. Traditionally, most Salafis, in the popular journalistic language, it's the Wahhabis, most Salafis, including Saudi Arabia, would obey those in office, and that's the major position. Then you have a very small segment that was willing to pick up arms and fight against the state, but a very, very new development took place in Egypt after when we talk about the Arab Spring. The Salafis now in Egypt are forming their own political party, and they are running in the elections. And this is a very new development, and it's a very, very important development. So things are not static, things are, I would say, moving forward. There's a new dynamic because of the Arab Spring. One might talk about later on about the Al-Nahda, but Imam Haramain al-Juwayni would say there is nothing absolute, ليس في الأمر قطع, and it's a very, very important notion about the political form of the state. Of course, one might argue ultimately that whatever political form that embodies the system of consultation to its best would be the best option, but that's also open for interpretation. Ibn Hazm, who happened to be mentioned by the Pope in his Regensburg lecture, and of course it's a reductionist position really, he said it is part of the فإن من حكم الله أن يجعل حكم لغير الله. That's a very beautiful statement. And I would like to translate the nuances of this statement. It is part of the divine order, if you will, divine governance or divine ruling, that ruling will be for someone other than God. That's a very, very beautiful statement. It's very important. And today there is no literalist school in Islamic thought, whether theological or juridical. We don't have any more, because Ibn Hazm founded a literalist basically school that did not survive, and that was the end of that school. But nevertheless, you find that he was not without important contribution, and many contemporary scholars will continue to consult Ibn Hazm's works for important insights. So here we have someone who says ultimately it is human beings who do govern, allowing the human, the notion of khilafah in the Quran is not a reference to the political office that emerged after the death of the Prophet. The notion of khilafah in the Quran is basically about human vicegerency, trying to implement that which is good for the community, good for humanity, etc. I mentioned basically the development amongst the Salafis, but let me just go over the political or apolitical Islamic movements and their positions. There are those who do not interfere in politics altogether. For example, the Nursi movement in Turkey, and basically spread out the Fethullah Gulen movement. It is all over the place. It's in North America, it's in Europe, it's all over the place. They are apolitical, they do not really run for office, they don't participate in the elections. The Tabligh and Dawah, probably the largest gathering of Muslims outside Mecca, is their own gatherings, but they are absolutely apolitical, they do not interfere in politics. The The Sufis, for the most part, they don't interfere in politics.
Is the sound
Can I change the...
Please do.
This will be a bit louder for the people sitting in the room.
Thank you. Thank you. The Sufis in general, they do not interfere in politics, except that when they do, usually they are on the side of the state, not on the side of the opposition. For example, in Morocco, they would be on the side of the king, not on the side of the opposition, even if the opposition is presented as an Islamic party or as an Islamic movement. So there remains the Salafis, and we spoke about them. The Islamic Liberation Party categorically rejects democracy, the Muslim Brotherhood. There is basically serious development in the thought of the Muslim Brotherhood, and it is manifested, for example, in the Al-Nahda party, more or less. Ghanouchi is a product of the Muslim Brotherhood thinking. And in Tunisia. This is if you skip the Islamic words from his narrative, you might think about a Western, basically political theoretician, political philosopher, speaking about democracy, freedom of speech. In general, yes. So this is something different that is emerging, and I would say that even on CNN, before speaking about Al-Nahda, they would say moderate Islamic party. Some people would give more voice to the opposition, thinking about the rights of women will be compromised now, but only a few months ago it was the rights of women that was compromised. They could not wear the head cover if they wanted to. Now, where democracy in terms of procedures and shura or Islam, cannot compare Islam and shura. We don't talk about religion and basically something that is less than a religion. But when we talk about procedures, in terms of procedures, in principle, procedures are okay. It depends about the larger picture, the philosophy of the law, the constitution, when we talk about the whatever country we talk about. But I would, just to represent where most Islamic thinking today would be, they would think about a Venn diagram when we talk about procedures, where there is a common area between democracy and shura, where representation will be okay, where elections will be okay, where the ballot box is okay to settle differences. Now, let me just provide, if democracy is about participation, we talk about everyone participating in politics, if it's about transparency, if it's about accountability, if it's about women, if it's about, and I can basically provide details later on, because simply this is an introduction, paving the way for your own questions and comments. If it's about women, if it's about minorities, the narrative itself would differ. And if it's about citizenship, definitely there is a large area where we talk about that Venn diagram, falling in between those who think that there is no compatibility or it's absolutely the same. So it is somewhere in between. Thank you.
Thank you.